Hi, welcome to Lesson 5 of City Vision University's Nonprofit Educational Program Design course. I'm Andrew Sears, and in this lesson we're going to be focusing on helping you design your educational program learning outcomes. So, as we present, or as I present this, I'm kind of modeling this. So this is a lesson learning outcome that I'm sharing right now. So after completing this lesson, you should be able to, most outcomes in academic settings start with a statement similar to this. And then you have a verb, and we'll talk about this more later, that relates to the learning. So describe the importance of having well-written educational program learning outcomes that link to nonprofit program outcomes, course outcomes, and lesson outcomes. So that's the purpose of the forum. Then in the final project, part 1, you're going to use a worksheet and develop a profile of an ideal program graduate as tools to develop educational program outcomes. And then you're going to actually develop your educational program outcomes following the best practices and also to make sure they support your nonprofit program outcomes. So that's going to be in the final project. So just tying this back to the overall course map, we're following the ADDIE model of instructional design. And the first 4 weeks, we focused on analysis. This week is really the first week where we're focusing on design. Learning objectives is where we're focused. And as I mentioned before, objectives and outcomes we're using synonymously in this course. Now, another way to kind of frame this week is, as I explained, we're going through this the whole logic model of proving that you're achieving your outcomes and you're achieving the organizational mission. And 2 weeks ago in week 3, we had you focus on the program outcomes with the logic model and theory of change of the program overall. But this week we're focusing on what I'm calling the educational program learning outcomes. So this is the program learning outcomes that are the subset that relates to the educational program. And then later in weeks, you're going to go through course learning outcomes and lesson learning outcomes. Now, it's really important to recognize, as I mentioned, there's 2 separate fields. There's nonprofit management as a field and education as a field, and they have different ways of measuring outcomes. So we're changing in this week. We're going to be focusing on how education does things. And the rest of this is going to be focused on the education model. And the idea, again, is that each of these things are going to provide proof as you go through that you're achieving these things. So as I mentioned before, there's 3 domains. There's the head, the heart, and the hands, or cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. And in this week, we're going to go a lot deeper into these 3 domains to help you understand them. But again, to relate these academic outcomes into the overall program logic model, the program logic model has short-term, medium-term, and long-term outcomes. But for most outcomes that are in the academic, they're usually going to fall into the short-term outcomes and outputs or medium-term outcomes. So, I'm using this course as a model to teach. So we, as I explained in the beginning, we use Bloom's taxonomy. And the idea is I'm trying to get you to remember. So each lesson is focused on trying to get you to first do this, then understand and apply. And then most of your final project is related at these higher levels. So this is an example of using Bloom's taxonomy. And the idea is that each of the learning outcomes is going to fall at each of these levels. So and I'll talk a little bit more about how that works for this course later. So on the affective or heart level learning outcomes, so this would be for spiritual development. And just to explain, as an example, so this would be, for someone's spiritual development, the bottom layer is receiving. So are you willing to listen to the message of the gospel? Do you attend church? And then responding would be actively learns about Jesus in your own time. So they're actually, into it. And then valuing would be to say, you know what, I value following Jesus. I'm going to make a decision to follow Jesus. Now, the next step is going to be organization. That's kind of a technical term. What it really means is going through and Christians call this sanctification, slowly Following Jesus, following Jesus slowly reforms your life. So you realize, you know what? I actually probably shouldn't, use drugs anymore, or I shouldn't, smoke anymore, or I shouldn't cuss people out, or, you're going to have these different parts of your life that, this, because you value this, that is going to change. And then ultimately characterization. So as followers of Jesus, we want to be characterize Jesus in our own life. So that's what it would look like for effective heart learning. Now, something that's really significant is the whole education model has this kind of academic bias in the learning domain. So there's a tendency of academic institutions to significantly overvalue cognitive domains of learning and devalue the affective and psychomotor. Part of the reason for that is cognitive. One, is a lot easier to measure. Two, it's what most academics like to do. That's their strength. But it's also strongly reinforced by accreditation structures. Trying to work with accreditors on these things is really difficult, and they focus on assessment of outcomes that are more easily measured. And the resulting process of this is it teaches, if you're familiar with the idea of worldviews, it's objectivism. Basically, that the only things that matter are the things that can be measured. And there's the famous quote that says, everything that counts can't be counted, and everything that you can count doesn't really count. And I think that that's important to recognize. Now, you have to be intentional at both the program level and institutional level to offset this bias. The effective, you can invest in mentoring, and this would be academic. This is part of what we try to do, with City Vision, practicum, community, service learning, spiritual formation, journaling, creative expression, effective questions, and psychomotor, granting credit for internships, practicum, service learning, co-ops, field experience. A lot of our students, they find it really challenging that we force them to work with organizations in most of our courses. Well, the reason is we don't want you to just have cognitive learning. We want you to actually learn, more hands-on and engaging with things. So let me just use some, quotes that kind of illustrate this. Within the Christian community, often, there's the quote, "The Word became flesh," but often Christians will teach that what they're actually teaching in terms of the methods they use in academia, Christian academia, is they said that the Word became text. So the Word became flesh meant that, Jesus became, Jesus is the Word and he became flesh. But for many of us, the thing that becomes important is just text, right? And then another quote is, in theological education or, Christian education, often the easier something is to assess, the less important it's likely to be. And no truth is taught by words or learned by intellectual means. Truth must be lived into meaning before it can be truly known. So all those are important quotes to recognize in balancing the domains of learning. So if you overemphasize one domain of learning, and this isn't just to say, because honestly, some ministries, they'll ignore the cognitive. So, but if you overemphasize the cognitive, you can have pride and irrelevance. You get the academic person who has, all these degrees, but doesn't really know what they're doing in the real life. Overemphasizing the affective domain, and you can kind of create this emotionalism. And then overemphasize the psychomotor domain, and you create empty technical excellence. So I've seen a lot of ministries that work with the homeless, and they're like, all we have in this, some of this is valid, some of it isn't. They say our people like to work with their hands, so we're going to make 100% of our students work with their hands, and we're going to teach them the most basic skills. Well, the problem with that is whenever you do that, often the most basic skills get replaced. Those are the jobs that are the most vulnerable. So you need to be supporting people in all three domains, and you need to have a holistic balance across all those domains. Now, in your educational design, we talked about doing Holland codes in terms of student intake and assessment. Well, it's important to recognize that in the Holland codes, you're going to have different students that like different things. So the buildings Holland code really relates to the psychomotor. The investigative is the most cognitive, right? And then organizing is also a cognitive. And a lot of these others, persuading can be cognitive and affective. So that's, what makes a good entrepreneur? Well, you have to have good ideas, but then you have to be able to persuade people. Helping is largely the affective domain, and creating is the cognitive and affective domain. But part of what you want to do is you want to be thinking about, okay, if my students on average are highly realistic, or highly social and in the helping domain, how am I going to support learning for that? Recognizing you don't want to pigeonhole people and say that everyone's the same, and also not support them in other domains, because that's going to create issues. Now, we also talked about the theory of change that Citygate Network and what used to be Association of Gospel Rescue Missions uses. They talk about the stable. So mentally and emotionally balanced and enjoying good health. So that's largely the affective domain of learning. And then you have schooled, enriched with fundamental knowledge to be competent and competitive. That's largely the cognitive domain. And then the skilled is being academically credentialed and on a career path. Now, that's going to not just be psychomotor, but it's probably going to integrate multiple of those. And then the idea is, if you can get all three of these, then you're going to get these other things. You're going to get a job, you're going to get people in a house, and you're going to they'll be able to give back to the community. So writing effective learning outcomes is a science. It's very challenging. I try to train people in it, and a lot of times people don't get it. So what they do is, learning outcomes should describe what learners should be able to know or do at the conclusion of a lesson, a unit, a course, or a program. So when writing learning outcomes, you have to identify the concept you want students to learn. And so, like, say the scientific method. So the level of knowledge that you want students to learn. So this is Bloom's taxonomy. You want them to be able to apply the scientific method. You might have evaluate, and then you would actually have people critique the scientific method. And then you'd have a verb. So, on the scientific method. So, and that's going to describe the observable behavior you want students to demonstrate. Apply the scientific method, and then identify any context or criteria of the learning outcome. Apply the scientific method to the explanation of life in outer space, and then identify the level of student you're developing these learning outcomes for, grade school, college, grade level, and often that's going to relate to the level of knowledge that you're looking for. So Bloom's taxonomy, usually you have action words. So the idea is you figure out what level are you trying to get people to learn? And then if it's remember, then you might start the sentence with define or duplicate or list or memorize or repeat or state, or, I often will use describe. Sometimes for that, if you're just, I guess it depends on if you're just describing the details or summarizing. Now, understand often will summarize, and that's why they use describe here. So classify, discuss, explain, identify, locate. Then apply is a very common one, but implement, solve, use, demonstrate. Analyze would be differentiate, organize, relate. Often if you're creating a table, comparing, the logic model, whenever we had you do the logic model, that was analyze. Evaluate, that would be where you're going to critique something, or and these are the words you would use for that. And then create, so design, assemble, construct, develop, investigate. Now, this is all in the generally in the cognitive domain. There's also the affective domain, and there the guy who developed that, his name's Crayworth, and you can use different types of verbs, on the receiving side of things. Where you're just showing that you're willing to pay attention and listen to with respect. You're showing that they're actively responding and participating, places value on a behavior, idea, person, or situation, prioritizes values and resolve conflicts between them, and a value system's internalized and controls behavior. So if you're trying to get someone to sobriety, then you're trying to get them up here, right? Whereas this would be, okay, you're going to listen to a lecture about the causes of addiction, and then the person responds, then they value what you're teaching, and then you're going to use these verbs to explain your learning outcomes. Now, so you have a verb plus a noun plus a context usually. So that's going to correspond to the level of Bloom's taxonomy. The noun's going to be, what you want them to learn. And then the context would be, the detail of, where you want it to apply. So identify the 7 steps in the research process, noun. And you could put when writing a research paper, that would be the context. So let me make this a little more concrete. So we're going to take Goldilocks and the 3 bears, and we're going to go through the Bloom's taxonomy with that. So based on Goldilocks and the 3 bears. So if you had a learning outcome where you're wanting to, lower level Bloom's taxonomy, describe where Goldilocks lived. That would be remember. Understand would be summarize what Goldilocks was about. Apply would be construct a theory as to why Goldilocks went into the house. Analyze, differentiate between how Goldilocks reacted and how you would react in each story event. Evaluate, assess whether or not you think this really happened to Goldilocks, and then create. Compose a song, skit, poem, or rap to convey the Goldilocks story in a new form. So that's just to explain, as an example. Now, let me use this course as a model of how we wrote these things. Now, this is a graduate level course, so most of the outcomes in this course are at the apply, evaluate, or create level. So look at these outcomes and the verbs I used in this course. So create a philosophy of adult education based on the principles of adult education. Each lesson, I have more learning outcomes than this, but this is the summative of what I want people to learn. And then develop a detailed assessment. So again, that's at the create level. That's a create verb of your client educational needs and a plan to assess client capabilities in the future. So this is week 2, what we did. Generate a detailed theory of change for your organization's holistic program and explain how your educational program components will support the larger program or outcome. So each of these, for the most part, are at the top level of Bloom's because this is a graduate level course, and that's where I want you to end up. Now, what's interesting is often you do what's called scaffolding. So in each lesson, what I've done is I'll start off with lower level Bloom's. So the forum, as I explained, so describe the importance of having well-written educational program learning outcomes that link to nonprofit program outcomes, course outcomes, and lesson outcomes. The reason why I had this be the assignment is this can seem very tedious to create these outcomes. The reason why this is important, though, for you is because you're actually trying to measure things that are really hard to measure. And to do that, you have to be precise in your wording. It may seem annoying to do that, but if you're going to be able to say, how do you know this thing happened? Well, I can say after you did that forum, did you actually do this? Because I was very specific about the verb. If I just said, one of the things you're supposed to avoid is never use the word understand, because it's hard to assess, did someone understand? I could have said, after completing this lesson, you should be able to understand learning outcomes. Well, I wouldn't be able to say, do you really understand it? And at what level of depth do you understand that? So that's why it's better to use, something like describe or complete a worksheet. Again, this worksheet is lower level Bloom's. It's more on the analysis stage, because creating outcomes is actually a creating. It's, this is developed. So that's highest level of Bloom's. But so I'm wanting you to do low level Bloom's, mid level Bloom's taxonomy, and then high level Bloom's. And that's the way a lot of these lessons are designed. So you can look at other examples of this. These are some examples of sample outcomes across cognitive and affective domain. This course itself is very focused on the cognitive domain. But say public speaking is going to be focused more on the cognitive and affective, domain. So, you're looking at what are the affective domain criteria that you would use for something like that. And the same thing for theological reflection on life and ministry. What you're trying to get them to do is explore their personal calling, deepen their commitment to integrated and missional ministry. And you're going to try to, assess that, which is, a lot more challenging. So, and, one thing that I mentioned is behavioral outcomes. Typically, and this is an important note to differ between the nonprofit learning outcomes model and the academic educational learning outcomes model. Nonprofits' behavioral learning outcomes are kind of their own category. In the academic world, behavioral learning outcomes fall within each domain. So you could have a knowledge level in the cognitive, but you could also have a behavioral level. So with that, let me just finally go over the final project this week. And in the final project, we're going to have you start off going through, and this is going to be a really challenging assignment overall, but you're going to go through an outcomes worksheet that's going to help you reflect on what your outcomes are going to be. Now, this is at the program level. This is not at a course level. So if you have multiple courses, you're going to think through all the outcomes that you're looking for. And this is doing some analysis to help you be ready to write your final outcomes. Then you're also going to do a profile of the ideal program graduate. And then finally, you're going to go into writing your program outcomes. So be sure you study before you get into this. Now, most of you are going to have cognitive domain and the affective learning domain. And as I mentioned, both of these are going to be, there's going to be behavioral. And the last part, what we want to do is you need to be thinking about this chart of how this connects with the program logic model. So it'd be fairly easy to just come up with some program outcomes, but then they don't tie into your educational program outcomes. They need to tie into your nonprofit overall program outcomes. So hopefully this is helpful. If you have questions, please ask your faculty member. Thanks a lot.